Cancer, I keep feeling drawn back to the same energy. It's almost like someone has spent so much time trying not to feel something that they forgot how exhausting it is to keep running from it. And now, that exhaustion is catching up with them. The first card that catches my attention is the Moon. There's something about this card sitting here that feels deeply personal, not dramatic, not loud, just hidden, quiet. Like emotions that were pushed into the background for so long they became part of this person's daily life. They learned how to function around them. They learned how to stay busy, stay distracted, stay focused on everything except what their heart was trying to tell them. And for a while, that may have worked. For a while, silence felt easier. Distance felt safer. Pretending not to care felt more manageable than admitting how much they actually cared. But something has shifted. What's interesting is that I don't feel this shift coming from outside circumstances. I feel it happening inside them. You know, sometimes people believe they can simply move on by refusing to look back. They convince themselves that enough time will erase the feelings, that enough distractions will eventually replace what was lost. But that's not what I'm seeing here. I'm seeing someone who keeps finding themselves revisiting the same memories, the same conversations, the same moments, and somehow, every road keeps leading back to Cancer. The Four of Cups appears, and immediately, I get this feeling of somebody sitting alone with their thoughts. Not because they want to, almost because they have no choice anymore. The things that used to occupy their attention don't seem to have the same effect. The noise isn't loud enough to drown out what they're feeling. There's a restlessness here, a quiet dissatisfaction. Something isn't sitting right with them anymore. And the more they try to understand why, the more your energy begins to surface. I keep hearing the phrase, "Why can't I let this go?" Because they've tried. I really think they have. They've tried telling themselves that enough time has passed. They've tried convincing themselves that life should be moving in another direction by now. But every attempt to close the door seems to leave it slightly open. And that's where things start becoming uncomfortable. Because once they stop running, they have to face themselves. They have to face the truth that maybe this connection mattered more than they allowed themselves to admit. Maybe Cancer mattered more than they ever said out loud. The thing is, I don't feel like this person intentionally wanted to hurt themselves by suppressing these feelings. I think they genuinely believe they were doing the right thing. Maybe they thought they were protecting themselves. Maybe they thought they were protecting you. But the Moon keeps bringing me back to those hidden places inside them. The places nobody else sees. The fears, the doubts, the questions they never voiced, and underneath all of that, there is longing. Not just for a person, for a feeling, for a sense of peace they haven't been able to recreate anywhere else. Then judgment enters the reading, and wow, something feels different here. It's almost like this person is beginning to hear something they spent a very long time ignoring. Not a literal voice, more like an inner knowing, a realization that keeps returning no matter how many times they push it away. And every time it returns, it gets harder to dismiss. I feel them looking back over the past, not through the lens of blame, not through the lens of regret alone, but through understanding. They're starting to see things they couldn't see before. They're beginning to recognize moments that seemed ordinary at the time, but now carry so much weight. A conversation, a smile, a quiet moment together, a feeling of comfort, a feeling of being understood. And that's where the Six of Cups begins speaking, because suddenly, the memories aren't random anymore. They're vivid. They're alive. It's almost as if this person can feel them. I keep seeing someone remembering simple things, not the grand gestures, not the dramatic moments. The small things, the peaceful things, the moments that felt safe, the moments when life wasn't demanding anything from them, the moments when they could simply be themselves. And somehow, Cancer keeps appearing in those memories, again and again. What's standing out to me is how surprised they seem by their own emotions. I don't think they expected this. I don't think they expected the distance to create clarity. If anything, they may have believed distance would create detachment. But that's not what happened. Instead, the silence became louder, the absence became more noticeable, the memories became harder to ignore. And now they're sitting in a place where everything feels different from before. Not because all the answers have arrived, not because every fear has disappeared, but because the truth is becoming harder to avoid. The truth is beginning to take up space. And the more space it takes up, the more this person starts questioning what comes next. Because once you finally admit something to yourself, once you stop pretending not to feel it, there's no easy way to return to who you were before. And I feel like that's exactly where this person is standing right now, right at the edge of that realization, trying to understand what their heart has been attempting to tell them all along. There's something about the Five of Cups sitting here that immediately changes the atmosphere. Not in a dramatic way. More like somebody finally allowing themselves to look directly at something they've been avoiding for a very long time. Because what I'm picking up on isn't just sadness, it's accountability. And those are two very different things. Sadness can come and go. People can distract themselves from sadness. They can stay busy. They can tell themselves tomorrow will feel different. But accountability has a way of following you. It waits. It sits quietly in the background. And eventually, it asks to be acknowledged. I keep feeling this person revisiting decisions they once defended, choices they were convinced were necessary, actions they justified at the time. What's interesting is that I don't feel anybody forcing these realizations onto them. This feels self-created, like they're sitting alone and suddenly seeing the entire picture from a completely different angle. And for some reason, Cancer keeps appearing in the center of that picture. Not because you're demanding answers, not because you're asking for explanations, but because your absence has created space for reflection. Space they didn't have before. The Nine of Swords appears, and this energy feels restless. I don't necessarily see somebody sleeping peacefully. I see somebody whose mind refuses to cooperate. Someone who keeps replaying conversations they wish had gone differently. Moments they wish they could revisit. Words they wish they had said. Words they wish they hadn't said. It's almost like they're having arguments with themselves. One side trying to move forward, the other side pulling them backward, and neither side is winning. What's standing out to me is how much guilt is tied to this. Not guilt because they got caught. Not guilt because they're facing consequences. Guilt because they're beginning to understand the impact of their choices. That's very different. Because when somebody finally understands how their actions affected another person, the weight becomes much heavier. I keep hearing this person ask themselves a question. What if I handled everything wrong? Not one decision, not one mistake, everything. And that's uncomfortable, especially for someone who spent a long time convincing themselves they were making the best choices available. Okay, let's stay there for a second. Because I don't think this person expected Cancer to leave such a lasting impression on their life. I really don't. I think there was a part of them that believed life would simply continue moving forward, that eventually new experiences would replace old memories, that eventually enough time would create enough distance. But instead, something else happened. The connection stayed with them, and the longer it stayed, the more questions began to surface. The Eight of Swords feels very personal here. I don't feel outside obstacles. I don't feel other people creating these restrictions. This feels internal. Like someone standing in front of an open door while convincing themselves they're trapped. Every possibility they consider immediately gets followed by fear. What if Cancer doesn't want to hear from me? What if too much time has passed? What if they moved on? What if they don't see me the same way anymore? For a lot of you, these thoughts aren't occasional. They're constant. They repeat themselves. They circle endlessly. And the more they repeat, the harder it becomes for this person to trust their own instincts. Because underneath all of these questions is a deeper fear. The fear that they may have lost something they didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. And honestly, that's what keeps pulling me back to this energy. Not regret over losing control. Not regret over losing comfort. Regret over losing something meaningful, something genuine, something that wasn't easy to find. The Hermit enters the reading, and everything becomes quieter. I feel distance here, not physical distance, soul distance, the kind that happens when somebody withdraws from the world because they're trying to understand themselves. Because here's the thing, this person isn't just questioning the connection anymore. They're questioning themselves. They're asking difficult questions. Questions nobody else can answer for them. Why was I afraid? Why did I keep resisting? Why did vulnerability feel so dangerous? Why was it easier to walk away than to stay? And these questions are leading them into places they've spent years avoiding. Old wounds, old disappointments, old beliefs about love, old beliefs about worthiness. For some of you, this person is beginning to recognize patterns they've carried for most of their life. Patterns that existed long before they ever met Cancer. And the realization is unsettling, because it means the story wasn't as simple as they once believed. It means the connection wasn't the problem. The feelings weren't the problem. The real challenge was everything they were carrying into the connection. Everything they hadn't healed. Everything they hadn't faced. Everything they hoped would somehow disappear on its own. And I think that's what makes this period so emotional. They're not just mourning what happened. They're mourning the version of themselves that kept choosing fear. The version of themselves that stayed silent when honesty was needed. The version of themselves that kept waiting for a perfect moment that never arrived. There's something incredibly humbling about that realization. Because once somebody sees it, they can't unsee it. I keep noticing this growing awareness, almost like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. Not all at once, not dramatically. One realization at a time, one truth at a time, and every truth seems to bring them back to the same place, back to the same feeling, back to the same connection, back to Cancer. The strange thing is the more they try to understand what happened, the less this becomes about the past and the more it becomes about the future, because eventually reflection leads to a crossroads. Eventually somebody has to decide what they're going to do with everything they've discovered. And I don't feel like this person has reached that answer yet. I feel them standing right before it, still searching, still questioning, still carrying the weight of everything they're beginning to understand. And somewhere within that silence, another realization is starting to emerge, one they may not be fully ready to look at just yet. There's something happening here that feels surprisingly simple, and yet it's the very thing this person has struggled to understand. The more they search for answers, the more they realize the answer was never hidden. It was always right in front of them. The Ace of Cups enters, and immediately the energy softens. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, not because every problem disappears, but because this person is finally allowing themselves to acknowledge what their heart has been trying to show them. And what their heart keeps showing them is you. You know, I don't think this realization arrived all at once. I don't see some dramatic moment where everything suddenly became clear. It feels much slower than that, much more human. It feels like 100 little moments adding up, a familiar song, a random memory, something they wanted to tell someone and realizing the first person they thought of was Cancer. A difficult day where they instinctively wish they could hear your voice. The kind of things people don't talk about because they sound too small, but those small moments matter because eventually they begin forming a pattern, and this person can no longer ignore that pattern. What's interesting is that I don't feel them comparing you to anyone. I feel them realizing nobody compares naturally. That's different. Because comparison suggests competition. This doesn't feel like competition. This feels like recognition. The recognition that certain connections leave a mark, not because they're perfect, not because they're easy, but because they reach places inside us that very few people ever touch. Cancer, there was something about your presence that made this person feel safe enough to stop performing. Safe enough to stop pretending. Safe enough to put down whatever mask they were carrying that day. And the strange thing is, they didn't fully appreciate that when they had it. Sometimes people don't realize what peace feels like until they're surrounded by noise again. Sometimes they don't realize what emotional safety feels like until they're back in environments where they have to protect themselves. And that's what keeps standing out to me. I feel someone looking around their life and noticing the difference. Noticing that conversations feel different. Relationships feel different. Experiences feel different. Something important is missing. The Six of Cups appears again, but it feels different this time. Earlier, it felt like memory. Here, it feels like longing, because they're no longer just remembering. They're feeling, and those feelings seem to arrive unexpectedly. Okay, I keep seeing someone trying to focus on something else and suddenly getting pulled into a memory they didn't intend to revisit. Maybe it's the way you laughed. Maybe it's the way you listened when they were talking. Maybe it's the feeling of being understood without having to explain every little thing. Whatever it is, it doesn't leave. And that's what surprises them. Because there were people before, there were connections before, there were experiences before, yet none of them seem to carry the same emotional weight. None of them seem to linger in quite the same way. The star appears. And this card feels incredibly personal in this reading. Because what I'm noticing is that Cancer became connected to hope inside this person's mind. Not hope in the sense of fantasy, not wishful thinking. Something much deeper. When life felt heavy, Cancer represented something lighter. When life felt confusing, Cancer represented clarity. When life felt overwhelming, Cancer represented calm. And once someone associates another person with that kind of emotional experience, it's very difficult to erase. I think that's what they're beginning to understand. They're not missing an idea. They're not missing a possibility. They're missing the way they felt when they were around you. And honestly, that's what makes this realization so powerful. Because feelings don't lie easily. You can argue with facts. You can debate decisions. You can rationalize circumstances. But feelings have a way of remaining honest long after everything else becomes complicated. I keep hearing this person say something they may never have admitted before. I felt more like myself around Cancer. Wow, that feels important. Because the older we get, the harder it becomes to find people who make us feel comfortable being completely ourselves. Most people see fragments. Most people see carefully selected pieces. But every so often, someone comes along and somehow sees beneath all of that. And instead of running away, they stay. That's what this person is reflecting on. Not what cancer gave them, not what cancer did for them, who they became when they were around cancer. The Nine of Cups enters the reading, and suddenly there's this awareness growing inside them. An awareness that the things they thought would fulfill them haven't quite done the job. Achievements came. Goals were reached. Life continued moving forward. But fulfillment is a different thing entirely. And that's where cancer keeps appearing again, not as a solution, not as an escape, but as a reminder of what genuine emotional fulfillment felt like. I don't think this person expected to arrive here. I think they believed they would eventually stop wondering, stop questioning, stop looking back. Yet the opposite seems to have happened. The more life moved forward, the clearer certain truths became, the clearer your significance became. And because of that, a new question is beginning to emerge. Not whether these feelings are real. That question has already been answered. The question forming in front of them now feels much bigger. It feels like they're starting to wonder what happens when someone finally stops denying what they want and starts considering what it might take to reach for it. The question itself seems to be changing them. Not because they've suddenly found every answer they're looking for, but because they're no longer asking the same questions they used to ask. For so long, their attention was focused outward. What should I do? What will people think? What makes sense? What feels safe? Those questions carried a lot of weight in their life. But something is happening here where those questions are slowly losing their power. And what remains underneath them feels far more personal. What do I actually want? What feels true? What happens if I stop living according to fear? The Death card enters, and honestly, the atmosphere around this reading shifts immediately. Not in a frightening way, not in a dramatic way. It feels like somebody's standing in front of a version of themselves they've outgrown. You know how sometimes people continue carrying things simply because they've carried them for so long? Old habits, old beliefs, old expectations, old identities. They become familiar, and familiarity can be difficult to release even when it no longer fits. That's what I keep feeling here. This person is starting to notice that parts of their life feel strangely disconnected from who they are becoming. Things that once felt important don't hold the same value anymore. Conversations feel different. Goals feel different. Even certain relationships feel different. It's almost as if they're waking up inside their own life and seeing everything from a new perspective. And that realization can be incredibly uncomfortable, because growth sounds beautiful until it asks you to let go of something. Until it asks you to release the version of yourself that kept settling. The version of yourself that kept choosing comfort over truth. The version of yourself that kept postponing difficult decisions. I don't feel like this person is resisting because they're stubborn. I feel like they're resisting because they're human. Change asks a lot from us. Sometimes it asks us to admit that we've been unhappy longer than we wanted to acknowledge. Sometimes it asks us to stop pretending we're okay with situations we've outgrown. And that's exactly where this energy seems to be leading. The Wheel of Fortune appears, and what immediately stands out to me is movement, not physical movement, internal movement. The kind that happens quietly before anyone else notices. The kind that begins inside a person's spirit long before it becomes visible on the outside. I keep seeing someone realizing that they've been standing in the same emotional place for far too long, almost waiting for life to make the decision for them, waiting for circumstances to change, waiting for clarity to arrive. Waiting for some unmistakable sign. But here's the thing. The sign may not be arriving from outside of them. The sign may be the discomfort itself. The sign may be the growing realization that remaining where they are no longer feels possible. There's something fascinating about this energy because it doesn't feel forced. Nobody is pushing them. Nobody is demanding action. This transformation feels self-generated. It feels like their soul has become tired of carrying contradictions. Tired of saying one thing and feeling another. Tired of pretending certain emotions don't exist. Tired of running in circles. And every time they try to return to old patterns, something inside them immediately recognizes that it no longer works. The Hanged Man appears, and this card feels deeply reflective here, because I don't see action yet. I see observation. I see somebody pausing, watching, questioning, reevaluating everything. For some of you, this person has spent years viewing their life through one lens, one perspective, one story. And suddenly that story doesn't seem complete anymore. They're beginning to understand that there were pieces missing, pieces they couldn't see before. Not because those pieces weren't there, because they weren't ready to see them. I keep hearing them say something like, maybe I wasn't looking at this correctly. Wow, that's a powerful realization, especially for someone who once felt certain about their choices. Because certainty can be comforting, but growth often begins where certainty ends. And I feel this person becoming more willing to question their own assumptions, more willing to admit they don't have everything figured out, more willing to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of avoiding them. That's not weakness. That's maturity. That's somebody beginning to evolve. Temperance enters so gently that it almost feels like a sigh, a long exhale after carrying tension for too long. And what I love about this energy is that it doesn't feel rushed. This isn't somebody trying to force themselves into a new version overnight. This feels gradual, intentional, authentic. They're learning balance, learning patience, learning how to stop fighting every emotion that rises to the surface. Because for a long time their instinct was to suppress, to control, to manage, to compartmentalize. But emotions don't disappear simply because they're ignored. Eventually they ask to be felt. Eventually they ask to be understood. And that's what this person seems to be allowing now. Okay, I want to stay here for a moment because something feels important. I don't think Cancer realizes how much of this transformation has been influenced simply by being who you are. Not because you forced change, not because you gave lectures, not because you tried to fix them. Your presence created a mirror, and once someone sees themselves clearly in that mirror, it becomes very difficult to return to old illusions. That's what keeps standing out. This person isn't becoming somebody new. They're becoming somebody more honest, more aligned, more willing to acknowledge what matters, more willing to admit what they've been feeling. And as that honesty grows, another layer begins to reveal itself. Because changing internally is one thing. Living according to those changes is something entirely different. And I feel like they're beginning to understand that the road ahead may eventually require choices they've been avoiding for a very long time. The realization seems to be settling deeper than they expected, not as a passing thought, not as an emotional reaction that fades after a few days. It feels like something that has become impossible to ignore because it keeps showing up no matter where they go or what they try to focus on. And what I'm noticing is that their attention is shifting away from what they lost and toward what they genuinely want to build. That's a very different energy because regret looks backward, intention looks forward. The Two of Cups appears, and immediately I feel this person becoming more honest with themselves about the connection they share with Cancer. Not through fantasy, not through wishful thinking, through recognition. There's something here about mutuality that keeps standing out. I don't feel them looking at Cancer as someone they need to save them. I don't feel them looking at Cancer as someone who exists to fix every problem in their life. What I feel is respect, a deep respect, the kind that develops when someone realizes another person has impacted them in ways they didn't fully understand until much later. Okay, I keep hearing this person acknowledge something they've struggled to admit. Cancer was never just another chapter. Cancer became part of the story itself. And once that understanding settles in, everything starts feeling different. Because if somebody matters that much, eventually you stop asking how to avoid your feelings and start asking how to honor them. That's what feels significant here. This person is no longer interested in finding clever ways around their emotions. They're beginning to understand that real connections require courage. And courage isn't about feeling fearless. It's about moving despite the fear. The Lovers enters the reading, and wow, this feels incredibly important. Not because I see perfection, not because I see a flawless path. I see choice, a conscious choice, a deliberate choice. A choice that asks someone to stop dividing themselves between what they feel and what they allow themselves to pursue. For a long time, I think this person kept separating those two things. They felt one way, they acted another way. They wanted one thing, they pursued something else. And eventually that creates exhaustion, because maintaining those contradictions takes energy. The more I sit with this energy, the more I feel someone becoming tired of living in conflict with themselves, tired of second-guessing, tired of questioning every emotion, tired of talking themselves out of what their heart already knows. You know, there comes a moment in some people's lives when they realize the hardest battle they've been fighting was never against circumstances. It was against themselves. And I think that's where this person is arriving. The resistance is weakening. The walls are becoming harder to maintain. The excuses aren't carrying the same weight they once did. Because beneath all of it, there's something very simple emerging. They care. They care deeply. And perhaps that's what has been frightening all along. The King of Cups appears, and this energy feels far more grounded than anything we've seen so far. What stands out to me isn't emotion alone. It's emotional maturity, growth, responsibility, a willingness to sit with feelings instead of running from them. And honestly, I think this surprises them. Because for so long, they associated vulnerability with weakness. They associated emotional honesty with risk. But something has changed. They're beginning to see strength differently. They're beginning to understand that strength isn't avoiding difficult conversations. Strength isn't pretending everything is fine when it isn't. Strength is showing up honestly. Strength is taking ownership. Strength is allowing another person to see the truth. I keep feeling this person thinking about actions more than words. That's important, because words are easy, promises are easy, intentions are easy, but action requires consistency. Action requires commitment. Action requires somebody to align their behavior with what they claim to feel. And I feel that awareness growing stronger. Almost like they're asking themselves, if I were given another opportunity, would I handle it differently? And what's interesting is that the answer seems less theoretical than before. It feels practical, real. They're beginning to think about what a healthy connection actually requires: trust, presence, communication, patience, the willingness to keep showing up. The Ten of Cups enters so gently that it almost feels like a vision appearing on the horizon. Not a fantasy, not an illusion, a possibility. And what makes this energy beautiful is that it doesn't feel focused on dramatic romance. It feels focused on peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing where you belong. The kind of peace that comes from feeling emotionally safe. I keep seeing this person imagining a life that feels calmer than the one they've been living. A life where they no longer have to fight themselves every day. A life where connection doesn't feel like something to fear. A life where love isn't something they keep holding at arm's length. And somehow, every time they imagine that future, Cancer keeps appearing inside it. Not because they're forcing the image, because it arrives naturally, almost instinctively. And that's what keeps catching my attention. The future they're beginning to envision isn't built around proving anything. It's built around sharing something real, sharing life, sharing experiences, sharing growth, sharing the quieter moments that often matter most. But before any of that can become reality, there's still one thing this person seems to be wrestling with. Not whether the feelings are there, not whether the connection matters, something much more personal. Because knowing what your heart wants is one thing. Finding the courage to place that truth into someone else's hands is something else entirely. And Cancer, that's where I'm going to leave this reading today. What keeps standing out to me is that this journey doesn't feel like it's being driven by pressure. It feels as like it's being guided by awareness. Someone is beginning to see things they couldn't fully see before, and sometimes that's where real change begins. Whether this person is still sorting through their emotions or slowly finding the courage to be honest with themselves, there is a sense that something inside them is no longer willing to stay asleep. As always, take what resonates and leave what doesn't. Trust your own intuition above anything else because you know your situation better than anyone. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I truly appreciate each and every one of you. If this reading found you at the right moment, then perhaps there was something here your soul needed to hear today. Take good care of yourselves, Cancer. Be gentle with your heart, keep moving forward in your own way, and I'll see you again very soon. Okay, my friends, bye-bye.